All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'll start with some introductions. And my name is Andrew Ross Thibodeau. I'm the president of the Clan Ross Association of Canada. I'm standing here with Gwen Robinson, curator of the Chatham Plaque Historical Society, Brenda, the president of the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society, and author Stephen Duff, who wrote a book on Dr. Alexander Milton Ross called Hunter of Dreams. I'll give a more formal introduction to Stephen in a few minutes' time. I also want to point out a few other notables here today. My wife, wearing the tartan sash, and also our membership chair and treasurer for the Clan Ross. Our vice president, Dennis Ross, and his wife, Shirley Ross. Our past president, Dennis Fletcher, and his wife, Barb. And our webmaster, Doug Ross, and our newsletter editor, Pat Ross. And my parents, who were smart enough to give me the middle name of Ross, Charles and Judith. I also like to special recognition to my Hunter clan, which is my in-laws side of the family, and welcome everybody to this very special day. I make my living as a professional motivational speaker, and my main audience is talking to high school and college university students. One of my programs is called Success Keys. What are the keys to success? And number 4 is family, friends, and if they're open-minded enough, faith is everything. The 3 F's, family, friends, and faith is everything. And it's because of family that we're here today. Every culture honors family. We know that. But the Scots had a very unique way of honoring family, and that's through what we call the clan system. And one of the most notable things from around the world with the Scottish family is the kilt and the tartans. In the past 100 years, the clans that have dispersed all over the world have decided to recognize their Scottish linkage and created clan associations. And 49 years ago, we'll celebrate our 50th anniversary next year, Clan Ross Association of Canada was founded. Our point is to bring people together for fun, for friendship, for family, and to remember the sacrifices of people in our past that brought us to where we are today. I think of my great-great-grandfather who arrived from Tain in Scotland in the 1855 to way up in Bruce County, cutting himself a farm and starting a new life that brought me to where I am today. For about the past 15 years, our clan association and our many members decide every few years to give some of our dues to some sort of historical project that honors a Canadian with Ross heritage for their contributions to our country. Previous examples included we helped contribute to the rebuilt ship Hector that brought the first Scots to Nova Scotia. It was a Ross that founded Victoria, and the monument to him was falling apart. We helped rebuild that. Rosses were part of the initial settlers of the Red River colony, which became Winnipeg, and we helped restore some of those tombstones. It was actually over almost 9 years ago that the idea of honoring Dr. Ross first came up. And as Doug Ross has pointed out to me, about 5 years ago, it was revealed that, you know what, we need to do a project set in Ontario. And thanks to Doug, who got in contact with Stephen Duff, Stephen wrote a book about, bluntly, what he called Canada's greatest abolitionist, Dr. Alexander Milton Ross.
Amen.
Descended from great Scottish Highlanders, born in Belleville, and gave so much tremendous sacrifice for the freedom of others. And in 2005, we approved that Dr. Ross would be the subject of our project. After many months of trying to figure out where to do the plaque, a phone call to Gwen Robinson changed everything. Well, I had heard from my friends at Uncle Tom's Cabin that if you want to know anything about Chatham Kent Black history, call Gwen. And I bluntly asked her opinion, where should we put up a plaque to Dr. Ross? We know he's from Belleville, but we want to center it somewhere in the heart of the Underground Railroad. And she said, your timing couldn't be more perfect. We're planning this BME Freedom Park. So it's with great honor, and after 4 or 5 years of planning, that we're here today to unveil this plaque that the Clan Ross Association of Canada was able to fund to add to this great park, which was opened about 6 weeks ago. Oh. And we so appreciate, again, the CK Black Historical Society for allowing us the privilege to add something to your amazing park. And I now call upon Gwen and Stephen to come over here and help me, I guess, pull this apart and reveal. Now you tied this, so okay. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. All right, cameras ready? All right, here we go. And voila.
Wow.
Black marble, and Ken Nedwig made sure it was really what he wanted when he designed it. And I hope the Ross clan is step up.
Sorry, we're just some people are taking the pictures there.
Oh.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yeah, yeah. Keep sharing.
And we were certainly approving of this. He has been one of my favorite people through the years, through my research. And I'm anxious to get into his book because I want the connection between Dr. Ross and John Brown. And I call them two of the greatest white abolitionists. Both men were certainly putting their life on the line. Dr. Ross did a few times, but John Brown ended up giving his. And I was so happy when I read about Dr. Ross being the Mason, but I'm not going to talk about Dr. Ross. You will have time when you finish to walk around the park and take pictures before we go back for a more formal presentation this afternoon. I'm anxious to hear the author of Hunter of Dreams. You're on a very historical corner. Oh, I can't move, can I? I won't. Here, on this corner, the BME Church was established with slaves that escaped from the United States. And the mother church was right here. You will see the blocks on both sides was actually the size of the church. It was rebuilt in about 1904, was comparable to some of the churches, they tell me, of its size in Philadelphia and New York. It had a pipe organ. It had a wine rug on the prayer room in the basement of the church. It was actually the who's who church in Chatham. However, when John Brown met here, the pastor at that time didn't agree with what he was doing and refused to let him use the church anymore. So they met in different areas, and you will see that back at the Wish Center. They moved the original church right there. It was sided by the Masonic family here, St. John's Lodge number 9. The old unhewn logs are on the inside of it. It's very historical also. And this corner here, the lady that did the sculpture of Mary Ann lived directly across the street. When Chatham started, blacks lived all over the city. And in the early years, they were at least 1/3 black. And they built blocks, and they did a lot of things here. But, however, the city fathers decided maybe they're getting a little too prominent all over. So they polarized us to the eastern portion of the city. But they did us a favor, actually, because this is a higher section of the city, and it didn't flood as much as it did in other areas. However, they still did not allow us to buy property in certain areas, and we have all those documents to tell what we did. We're hoping to finish the park in a year or two with another sculpture, and hopefully add to the property and get a larger facility for our displays. You'll see when you go back to the Wish Center. We're rather crowded, but still we went ahead and still are attempting to tell this marvelous story of Chatham. And I want you to know Dr. Ross was definitely a part of it. I cannot, and I'm going to hear more about this, He was invited to the meeting here in May, but he left Boston. I hope I'm telling this right. He left Boston before the letter from John Brown arrived, but they were certainly two men that I honor highly in our history. And so with that, come along.
Now, as I said, as we searched out a recipient of our recognition, our webmaster Doug got in contact with Stephen, who had written this book, and we've invited Stephen today, who's become a bit of a expert on Dr. Ross, to say a few words here, and then do a longer presentation back at the Wish Center, which we invite all of you to hear. So he's a retired public school teacher from Toronto, now living in Parry Sound, Stephen Duff. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I love moments like this in which diverse communities get together in a common cause, which of course today is to honor the memory of this remarkable individual, Dr. Alexander Milton Ross. I don't know of any other instance in which there has been an individual who improved the lives of so many people should be so unrecognized. And it was very kind of Andrew to say that I was an expert on Dr. Ross. I'm not a professional historian. By professional background, I'm a musical background. But I've always had a very active interest in history, which occasionally gets overheated. The result being this book, Hunter of Dreams. And I don't know why this didn't occur to me before, but the presence of the word hunter in the title, of course, Andrew's in-laws are the hunters. So I don't know, there's some sort of cosmic thing at work. I like to think anyway. And I'm just sort of speaking on the fly here without any formal notes. While we were doing the unveiling, I couldn't help noticing that the veil was in the form of a quilt. Now, quilts are an essential part of the lore of the Underground Railroad because this was the internet of the Underground Railroad. And the way it worked was that slaves escaping from places like Alabama, Louisiana, and so on, they looked for safe houses along the way, which for the most part were sponsored by Quakers. And there were all these different quilt patterns that acted like a sort of telegraph, so that if you were approaching a house to tie up for the day, because they all traveled at night, sheltering by day, you could tell whether the safe house was in fact safe by whatever quilt was being displayed on the front veranda railing. And one of the things about writing history, especially novels, is that you think you've covered everything, and then the thing gets published, and then you start finding out all sorts of other neat stuff. And one of the neat things that came my way, my older daughter, who's a professor of French at Carleton University, is also very, very keen on different aspects of Black history. Her specialty, in fact, is French language literature by Black writers from the Caribbean and Africa. But associated with that, she's also got a very active interest in the Underground Railroad and loaned me a book called In Plain Sight. Have you seen that one?
In Plain View.
In Plain View.
And
Jacqueline
Calvin.
Okay, thank you. A fascinating read. And when you think of the sheer guts of everybody concerned with this thing, you know, the most prominent, well, certainly John Brown is part of both Canadian and American lore, historical lore. But here we have Alexander Ross, who is comparatively obscure. Now, in terms of, as Gwen put it, putting your life on the line, taking risks, I mean, these guys were masters at it, and of course, as we know, John Brown paid with his own life. Alexander Ross, and I'll get into this in a little more detail later, but he did extensive traveling in the southern states, cluing the slaves into the existence of the Underground Railroad and directing them with, you know, some basic instructions, a little bit of food, maybe a knife or two. Go that way, follow the North Star, just keep your eye on it at night, and find a house with a quilt hanging on the front veranda railing, and that'll be your haven for the day. And so obviously, you know, the word hero gets bandied about an awful lot. I mean, you have I think it's a video game, a Guitar Hero. Somehow, for me, that doesn't quite cut it. To me, the real heroes are the people who, at least some inconvenience, if not downright danger to themselves, go out and make a difference, which is exactly what Dr. Ross did. And so it's such a pleasure to be able to pay tribute to him today, especially in view of the work I have done compiling material about him, which turned out to be quite a process, and then getting so hooked on it that I had to, well, I'm a compulsive storyteller and collector, so that was the logical extension of it. So anyway, this is a wonderful day. When I was, it was my great pleasure 3 years ago to be invited to the gathering of the Clan Ross, and I'd forgotten about this, but I was reading Andrew's memory book last night, the one that I forgot to return to him this morning, and it had a quotation from me that I thought the entire day was cosmic, and that's something that would certainly apply to today. So this is a truly cosmic gathering and a cosmic cause, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Just one thing, and I thought about it while you were speaking. I see a Mason or two here, and it was through that Masonic family when Dr. Ross was in prison. I believe that Joe come back and said, "Here I am."
Yep.
And he gave the Masonic sign, which helped him, and certainly they didn't string him up that night. And Joe was back by morning, and it was a tremendous story.
And it's in the book.
Goody!
If you don't have the book, the museum.
Stephen, you.
Patterns and happenings.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Ann.
Am I not a woman?
Okay. Oh, you do it. Nice behavior, but that's the kind of thing.
Andy, I'm dipping down in front.
Wow.
Oh,
Dennis.
I'm going to ask somebody. It's not. Where is the point? That's a good block. I think that one over there.
Yeah, that's the.
Yeah, that's a big mistake. She was going to find out. That's the walkway to freedom. That's the walkway to freedom. Right.
What they call the Bridge to Freedom. A statue of Mary Ann Shadd Carey and the Dr. Ross Plaque Ulysses.
Music has long been a part of our people's culture and tradition. The African villages were filled with drumming, the sound of horns, song and dance. In music, they rejoiced at the birth of a child, At weddings, yes, at burials, recounting their shared lives and announcing the good news. The African and his music were one. Our ancestors enjoyed complex rhythms with overlapping beats and tempos. Rhythms were syncopated. It ebbed and flowed with precision. Our African past was all but destroyed by slavery. However, one thing they could not destroy: the oral tradition of the slave's African heritage and his music. Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya, Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya, Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya, oh Lord, Kumbaya. While music was entertaining and educational, it was also sacred and healing. It was this knowledge of the power of music that the Africans gave the world. From a sociological point of view, music was far more important than preaching, because these songs predated preaching as we know it today. It was the music of the enslaved more than anything else that gave them a sense of community. Spirituals were the enslaved person's comment on their situation and their testimony about the confusing and terrifying world of the slave ship. It was the African's musical journey from Africa to the American shores. Walk with me, Lord, walk with me. Walk with me, Lord, walk with me. All along life, teacher's journey, I want Jesus to walk with me. There is evidence that the music of present-day Black Americans and Canadians contains a direct link to Mother Africa. The songs that filled the slave vessels, when those shackled below deck, produced songs of sorrow and longing for home. They had no weapons strong enough to defeat the enslaver. Only an unflinching faith in a supreme being was their means of survival. For every African who reached the American shores alive, many died at one end or the other of that dreadful middle passage. Many chose to take their own lives, preferring death to the alternative of the unknown. Upon realizing they could not escape, many chose that home where every day will be Sunday by and by. By and by, when we reach that home beyond the sky, where the wicked world sees some struggling, and the world will be at rest. So every day will be Sunday by and by. John Newton, who was born in London, England in 1725, became a captain of a slave ship in 1745. And in 1748, on a return voyage to England with his cargo, Newton survived the fierce Atlantic storm. He thanked God for his safety and became an evangelical Christian. However, Newton saw no contradiction between his newfound faith and his participation in the enslavement and ill treatment of the Africans. Poor health forced Newton to retire from the slave trade in 1754. 10 years later, he gained ordination as an Anglican priest. By the late 1770s, Newton had repented of his involvement in the slave trade and became one of its leading opponents. Together with William Cowper, the renowned poet,
Newton published the only hymns in 1779. Among the selections included in this volume was Amazing Grace, which Newton wrote as a reflection upon divine forgiveness for his sinful participation in the slave trade. One verse, which is not in our hymnals today, states, "In pleasure all I took delight, unawed by doubt and fear, till a new object caught my sight and stopped my wild career."
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. I was blind, but now I see.
Work songs usually filled the air on the plantations in the South, where the enslaved labored. The songs seemed to take one's mind off the grueling task at hand. Singing just seemed to make the work easier. The sound of slaves singing was comforting to the master's ears. It soothed his conscience by believing his property was contented, perhaps even happy with their plight. The songs masked the slaves' true feeling. They often sent messages to fellow slaves about a clandestine meeting.
I'm going to lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm going to lay down my burden down by the riverside, study the war no more. We ain't gonna study the war no more. Ain't gonna study the war no more. We ain't gonna study the war no more, no more. Ain't gonna study the war no more. Ain't gonna study the war no more. We ain't gonna study the war no more.
Those times when they secretly met in a pre-planned place and shared their personal stories and pleaded to God to help them, the Africans soon realized the differences in the religion of the master and a true Christian experience. They accepted Christianity while reinterpreting some of its elements. The African Christianity and faith is in line with true biblical roots and insistence on a personal conversion.
Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I pray.
The songs and a belief in their God seemed to provide the strength needed to carry on. The words could not adequately express the heaviness and loneliness felt by the slave. Perhaps when a loved one had been sold or brutal treatment had been perpetrated on a fellow slave, they would offer how often holler out as a way of relief. Sometimes another slave would respond in African dialect. This was eventually called the call and response. As time passed, the spirituals were born. The moans of the oppressed, the cries of those cruelly mistreated came from deep within.
I couldn't hear nobody
was extremely important to the slave. His life mirrored their mistreatment. They heard about him being nailed to a tree for man's sins, and knowing about this sinless person being abused for man's transgressions seemed to help them triumph over their brutal treatment. When a slave was being tortured, they usually had an audience to teach other slaves a lesson. With every crack of the whip, did their faith die? No, for the death of Jesus was their hope. They knew that the grave could not hold Jesus, so with a song in their hearts, the slaves kept him alive. They simply asked the question, "Were you there?"
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord?
Many slaves who were outraged over their lot of slavery, the vision of freedom became paramount in their minds. They clung to a dream of having a family and living in a community free to work and worship as they wish. The threat of being sold away from family was always present in the slave's mind. Daily he lived and longed for a chance to escape. They would travel by night, preferably through swamps, or by following the North Star north to freedom, and hide away during the day. The perils that beset the runaway slaves were numerous. Lack of food, poorly clothed and tired. However, the thought of freedom and the blessings others seemed to be enjoying prompted them to continue on the journey. When the slave hunters come near, the escapees would often try to find a creek or a swamp to hide, so the bounty hunters' hound dogs would lose their scent and pass by. The spiritual "Wade in the Water" became one of the songs sung by those on the trek north.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God is gonna trouble the water. God is gonna trouble the water.
Slave mothers never had time to spend with their children. They worked oft-times in the field until time to give birth. They rose early in the morning to give the children food before going to the field. If they were lucky on their plantation, they had an elderly woman who would take care of the children while the mothers worked. One of the saddest slave mother stories was when a mother saw her young son being sold on the auction block. She impulsively started to cry. When the lad saw his mother crying, he tried to console her by saying, "Don't cry, Mama. I'll be a good boy." This is truly the bitter dregs of slavery, not knowing what was going to become of your child.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless
most critical aspect of social change and development for the New World African was the resistance they demonstrated to total dehumanization. The religion or belief in God they developed was focused on this resistance. It surfaced in the music of the antebellum slave period and was carried out by the instrumentality of the oral traditions that survived the horrendous Atlantic slave trade. The spiritual became rooted in a black lifestyle that was desperately trying to cope with the poorest of social conditions. There never was acceptance of those inhumane conditions because hope was always the spiritual's central theme. Nearly all spirituals are derivatives of biblical themes. And when the slaves became of age and found life unbearable with no hope of attaining freedom, one spiritual which talks about death was a call for relief and a safe passage in a better place where they would be forever with the Lord.
Soon I will be done. Troubles of this world, troubles of this world, troubles of this world. Soon I will be done. Troubles of this world. I'm going home to live with God. I'm going home to be with my Lord.
The advent of gospel music completed a full circle of black musical expression on the North American continent. Black sacred music commenced with the creation of the spirituals, influenced by meter music, which in turn colored the use of Euro-American hymns by black Canadians. They were sons of faith in God and spoke of hope and aspirations in the face of devastating social conditions. Gospel music clearly identifies with the circumstances of the black community in America. Thomas Dorsey, known as the father of gospel music, was the chief architect of many hymns. Somebody once said about his music, it was a message of good tidings expounded by one who had walked the path of trouble in hard times. Dorsey combined the attractive musical forms of the secular world with religious sincerity. The rise of gospel music around the 1930s is attributable to several sociological changes in the black community. The migration of blacks from the South in search of greater economic opportunities and more freedoms afforded them in the North. The musical traditions of these various religious denominations were maintained in the churches. Hence, the seeds of gospel music came into full bloom. It is fair to note that this new form of music met some hostility on the pretense that it was sin music. That Thomas Dorsey confesses that this early rejection inspired his determination to continue. He met in churches that received him and frequented the National Black Convention until the new music caught on. To some, gospel music may have sounded distasteful in its years of rejection. It talked about things that mattered to most of the poor people. The gospel world quickly took note of what was going on in the South and saw their speech or words as a way to tell about the struggles for freedom and dignity.
Nobody knows the trouble I see. Nobody
Georgia, he was summoned home by special request from his wife, who had suddenly became very ill. Prior to boarding the train to take him home, he received word his wife had died. With a heavy heart, he journeyed south to bury his much-loved wife. However, mid-journey, before he reached the borders of Georgia, he was handed a telegram advising him a son had also passed away. Broken-hearted, he prayed, "Lord, take my hand." A friend who was traveling with him at the time heard his words and stated, "No, Thomas, call him precious Lord."
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me to stand, for I am tired, I am weak, I am worn through the storm, through the night. Lead me on to that light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
The spirituals are the heart music of all African American music. Black congregations have retained some of the style and character of the songs and the link to Mother Africa. Gospel music completes the full circle of black music on the North American continent. It is clearly identifiable with the social circumstances of the black community in America. One day, in 1955, December the 1st, a tired seamstress refused to give up her seat on the Montgomery, Alabama bus. That lady was Rosa Parks. Her resistance ignited the civil rights movement, and it is safe to say that the freedom movement in the South is a singing movement.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. If in our hearts we do believe, we shall overcome someday.
Musical makes possible the restoration of lost hopes and binds up the wounds of the brokenhearted by its character and puts together the cohesive sentiment of a group of peoples of common experience. The Negro spirituals and their meaning have produced a unique effect on the freedom movement in the South. We must never forget the religious orientation of the freedom movement, which intensifies the effect produced. This journey today was dedicated to Rosa Parks, who died October the 24th, 2005. From the spirituals to gospel music, we have the birth of the freedom song.
If you'd like to join me, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last.
that's a whole different matter altogether. And a number of very notable people have made reference to that same idea. For example, I got it in here. There was a writer named Brian Morton. He wrote a book called Starting Out in the Morning. And he said, the human world is bound together not by protons and electrons, but by stories. Nothing has meaning in itself. All the objects in the world would be shards of bare, mute blankness spinning wildly out of orbit if we didn't bind them together with stories. So the stories then make up the fabric of who and what we are. And to me, one of the great stories is the story of Alexander Milton Ross. And I'll just do a quick recap of how I got interested in the subject. While I taught music, I also did some teaching of history, which is a field that I find absolutely fascinating, and history and music go so well together in so many instances. I was teaching a summer course one year for senior students, and part of the program was for them to give seminars on topics drawn from a list made up by me, and one of the topics was Canada's role in the Underground Railroad. Well, two of the young ladies did a thing mentioning this Alexander Milton Ross. Now, this was in 1986, and I'd never heard of Alexander Milton Ross. And I thought, why have I not heard of Alexander Milton Ross? So I did a little bit of research, discovered that he had written an autobiography. I managed to get hold of it. It had to be sent all the way down from Thunder Bay. That was where the nearest copy was. There wasn't one to be had in Toronto. I started reading it, and I thought, oh, I only had it for a week. So I frantically read and raced home from school every day and sat down with Dr. Ross's book, took notes so I wouldn't forget anything, and ended up with a pile of paper about this thick. And Ross's writing was like reading a Canadian Tire catalog. It was about, stylistically, it was about unexciting as it gets. And I thought, I think we can do something here. So the result was Hunter of Dreams, which is stocked here at the museum at $28.95. Just thought I'd let you know. So I had to approach this subject rather carefully because first of all, I'm comfortable writing in the first person, but I was not going to adopt Dr. Ross's persona, and so I invented a friend for him. I figured there were a lot of times when he needed a friend anyway, and led it from there with the friend telling the tale. Probably the most remarkable part of Ross's career was the time that he spent down in the southern states, and some reference was made to that earlier in the day about how he would travel in the southern states, making use of various connections. He belonged to the Masons, as Glenn mentioned. He was also a naturalist and would travel in the southern states pretending to do bird research, but in actuality he was informing the slaves of this escape route known as the Underground Railroad, and the slaves, with their background and education and so on, tended to take things rather literally and thought it was some sort of a magic subway or something. But once they got familiar with the thing, up they went. And one thing that I meant to say out of the park, and it somehow got away on me, is I referred to John Brown and Alexander Ross as heroes, but what about all these escaped slaves? Think of what they went through. One parallel I like to draw is, try to imagine yourself in the year 2009 wearing an orange jumpsuit and trying to come from, let's say, New Orleans up here, traveling by night, trying to be inconspicuous. It must have been absolutely terrifying, and yet they did it. They did it. They left what was bad as it was, at least it was familiar. But they did it. They came here. And now we're in a place that celebrates that journey. There's a bit of a misconception lingering to this day that slaves were sort of a docile bunch and didn't do a whole lot to rebel against their masters. Although of course Harriet Beecher Stowe in that masterwork of hers, Uncle Tom's Cabin, informed us of these terrible conditions that many of the slaves worked under. I might remark that one of the things that was a little confusing for Alexander Ross was there were some places he went to that were actually quite pleasant, and slaves were reluctant to leave. So, not all of them made the journey, but the ones who were in the hardcore bad plantations, they were ready to jump on the wagon. But there were certain rebellions and uprisings that took place. There was a celebrated one, I forget the year, I think it was 1845, led by a certain Nat Turner. There was an early rebellion led by a fellow named Gabriel. This was in 1800. There was one in Augusta, Georgia in 1819, and another one led by a guy named Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. Now all these rebellions failed, but it was sort of like a wake-up call, that things were not going to go on this way forever. And it was through the news that came trickling up through the States and into Canada about slave conditions. And there were people, fortunately.
Yesterday that she just took off.
Wow.
And she was lucky enough, she had her the babysitter, but she left the camera because she knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And so the babysitter got the first.
She took.
Oh, I love going there.
It's a fun little place, eh? Yeah. Supper time's
Was it
amazing.
an old hotel or something? Or what was it? It's been a restaurant.
It's always been there.
It's been there for a number of years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
We stopped it coming down, we came out.
And she had, this is her husband. Oh, this is Vince, her second husband. Her first husband was Plaque. She had one daughter when she lived in Detroit. But he's Dana and Cannon's brother. And when she went to California,